Is Karen's sending it to everyone?
No. I just have a deleted message from her, but
That's
I can pull it up on the email. Hold on one moment.
Oh, you have to look under participants, I think.
Okay, 1 second. I looked at it earlier, so okay. All right. So are you guys ready?
Yes.
Okay. So good evening. We are calling our meeting to order. We are going to recess for an executive session for approximately 1 hour to finalize the superintendent's evaluation.
Casey, can you hear me? Are you or Karen the host for this meeting?
Karen is, Jewel. Casey and I are co-host.
Okay, so I need that person to
Give you control of the screen.
allow me to share my screen that's saying it's disabled. So I was just kind of testing it, but
Yeah,
not ready yet.
I told Karen.
Okay.
Dr. Harmon, do you want to try it now?
Yes, it says it's going to stop other people's screen sharing, and that would be what I would like to do.
Okay.
Just want to make sure.
We are live, Jewel.
Yep, it's okay.
There you go.
Okay,
We see it.
perfect.
Good evening and welcome to the June 17th work session for Kent School District. It is 6:34. We will be discussing tonight the Kent School District fall reopening. And I would like to, it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Watts to begin the work session. Dr. Watts.
Oh, mute.
There we go. Thank you, President Hamada, members of the board, Ms. Holly, staff, and community. Thank you. Today, we are pleased to present to you what would be the perfect example of the more things change, the more they stay the same presentation. And the reality is that we are simultaneously bringing closure to 2019-20 academic year and also preparing for what is to come in the fall for our reopening. We have had several committee conversations. Staff have been working hard and smart. And today we're going to provide you with a high-level overview of where we are and what decisions still are yet to be made as we prepare for our fall reopening. I'm going to call on Dr. Jewel Harmon, Chief Accountability Officer, to begin our presentation this evening. Dr. Harmon.
Good evening, President Hamada, members of the board, Dr. Watts, Ms. Howley, community. Like Dr. Watts said, I'm going to share on behalf of KSD an overview of the guidance from OSPI, some things to consider and primary considerations for all school districts, not just the Kent School District, with moving forward, where we've been as a school district and where we're going in regards to developing a plan for opening our schools in the fall. So if you'll bear with me just a second, I'm going to share my screen so that you can see. And I'm assuming that everyone can see that.
Mm-hmm.
Wonderful, thank you.
Thank you.
So 2021 school year operational plan. So a little bit of background context. We're all familiar with our March 13th announcement from our governor, essentially pushing all school districts in the state of Washington into campus closure and a remote learning option for the remainder of the 2020 school year, even though that wasn't the intention on the 13th of March, that ended up being the case. We're all well aware of the challenges that Kent has gone through over the past 4 months with closure, and they're not uncommon in other districts. We had to adjust to differing schedules, unfamiliar tools, significant changes for what that meant being a staff member in your household and the needs of your household and balancing that, students and the tools that they needed to support their remote learning experiences, in addition to families struggling with other financial and food security issues as well. So now that we are in the midst of closing out our current school year, our state has issued guidance on what the fall, what it would take to open school districts in the fall and provide some guidance and support for that. Although they did not provide any set absolute model and directive for school districts, what they did say is that schools will look different in the fall. Even if that is a traditional face-to-face experience, it will not be the same face-to-face experience that we're all familiar with when we think about schools opening. And based on that, they've created flexibility and space for school districts to confer with their board, with their community, with their staff, to determine the best path moving forward. And this is our first opportunity to bring that information to the board and get some initial input from our board about what that looks like. So once this PowerPoint is on BoardDocs, all of the links in the PowerPoint are live. So this particular link actually gives the full plan access. So for those who haven't seen it, that's what exists there. And so in the beginning of this plan, Superintendent Reichdahl wrote a letter to the districts and to the public, some table of content pieces, but there are 4 commitments of the work group that convened for OSPI. And so it was almost OSPI's admission of their learnings and reflection over closure, as well as their commitment to accountability for some of the things that need to take place moving forward in order for all districts in the state of Washington to benefit. So for example, focusing on educational justice from a student support perspective and prioritizing those students furthest away from educational justice, preparing for health and safety for the 2021 school year, and I'd probably argue and beyond, investing in connectivity and hardware. One of the things that we know is that there were some challenges with connectivity that even our one-to-one and hotspot dissemination could not fix. If there are truly deserts of internet connectivity due to lack of tower access and other things, that is more of a system, statewide system support than it is a school district support. And then leveraging local expertise and providing training. And so as we all know, regardless of the tools that are in place, professional development is always necessary to help all parties maximize their use of those tools. One of the things that OSPI called out specifically was about a learning management system and platform. And so what is that system that school districts or a school district uses to store information, to communicate information to parents, to house their distance and remote learning options. And based on number 4, I would say that OSPI probably discovered that most school districts had multiple tools and platforms at their disposal, making that transition even more interesting. So before we get into the plan and what the guidance is from OSPI, I want to talk about some of the statutory requirements and waivers that were in place during COVID and what that means for our fall when we open. So our instructional hours and days, our board may remember that we, I think 2 regular meetings ago, passed a resolution around waiving the instructional hours and making and delivering that resolution and application to OSPI on Kent School District's behalf. And it waived the instructional hours and days requirement. Moving forward in the fall of 2021, that waiver opportunity is not believed that it will be in place. The same thing with attendance and enrollment. It is expected that districts will be required to take attendance in the fall in the traditional sense. Assessments. Currently, we have a waiver with the Federal Department of Education for state summative assessments. That's because state summative assessments are actually a federal requirement and not a state requirement. OSPI intends to pursue a similar waiver for 2021, but the federal government has given no indication that they are going to accept or approve those waiver requests at this time. So the recommendation from OSPI is to build calendars for your 2021 school year as if all of those federally mandated summative assessments take place. And what I'm referring to is smarter balanced assessments in the spring. As far as learning standards, as part of that grading shift during COVID, districts were encouraged to identify and agree upon the primary and essential learning standards for students. And moving forward, although there's not that need to shift the grading, they're encouraging districts to come together to engage in a district-wide and succinct identification of essential standards for students across each grade level, program and content area, and that instructional plans should then support that narrowing of standards to ensure that there's high engagement and rigor. So think about it in terms of digging deep and not going wide. And then as far as grading goes, the emergency rule prohibiting F grading expires at the end of the 2021 school year and will not be extended. That does not mean, according to OSPI, that districts shouldn't consider and reevaluate their grading policies. and having consistent grading policies across the district. And so they talked about looking at that and approaching that, going back to OSPI's 4 commitments for themselves as a governing agency of focusing on that justice piece. And so what does an equitable system of grading, instruction, and assessment look like, and how are student groups impacted by those decisions? Questions about the key statutory requirements before we move forward?
No.
Okay, and I'm going to say, please feel free to interject because I can't see faces when I'm sharing my screen this way.
Right.
Okay, so health and safety requirements. So in addition to laying out some of the statutory regulations and waivers that will not be accessible to us in the fall, they spent quite a bit of time talking about general just health and safety requirements and recommendations, and starting off with just general guidance to ensure districts are responsible for ensuring that staff are trained in the health and safety protocols, including how to screen for symptoms, how to maintain physical distance, what appropriate personal protective equipment is, PPE, the frequent and cleaning hand washing protocol. I'm sure that we all know about the 20-second rule with hand washing now, but making sure that all are familiar with that. And then what to do if someone develops signs of COVID. They encourage communication regularly with families, emphasizing the importance of staying home when sick, reminding them about physical distancing and hand hygiene as well. And then the reminder just in general that all students, staff, volunteers, and guests must wear a cloth face covering in K-12 settings. In addition to the, oh, sure, please.
I was gonna say, is it okay now to ask questions, or do you want to finish with the?
No, we've got quite a bit of content to go through. So now would be the best time, it's fine.
Okay, I've actually had some questions from the public. I wrote them down. You know, a lot of kids don't want to keep their masks on. I know my 6-year-old refuses to keep her mask on when we go to the store. It's a constant struggle. So is there any plan for how it's going to look, especially for the younger kids in kindergarten and possibly first grade, with, you know, having to consistently wear the masks and have them keep them on?
So there's a little bit more detailed suggestions in the plan, but it doesn't really deviate. So for example, there was a time period nationally where I think there was children under 2 or something like that didn't have to wear masks and that kind of thing. There's not an age requirement in this particular plan that excludes certain students from having to wear a mask. It does exclude certain students based on other health considerations that may not be able to wear a mask. And then it leaves it up to the discretion of the district to determine that piece of what to do if a mask is not acceptable. Anecdotally speaking, as a parent of a 3-year-old, we've been very creative with his mask wearing, everything from we're going to pretend to be a ninja today, or today we're going to pretend to be doctors. If you're going to be a doctor, then you've got to wear your mask. And we practice. He still gripes a lot, but it's gotten better. And I think that I don't want to call this normal, but it's part of our new reality. And so I think part of that protocol and training isn't just training for adults, it's part of that kind of training for students as well, of what it means to be in school in the fall. So we can talk a little bit more about some of the alternatives to a mask that districts could use, but there's not an exclusion by any grade level or age.
Okay.
And to be clear, there are some for students that medically can't wear them for whatever reason, or there are exclusions in that for certain students.
Yes, and there are some alternative PPE options as well. So it's not that they would go maskless. For example, the face shields are an option kind of thing. That's another option. So there will be a face covering. It just may not be a mask over their mouth and nose in that way.
I just want to chime in with this because being around small children, which I am frequently, I just cannot imagine how this is going to work in the younger grades. And I mean, I have a granddaughter who she's kind of a nut because She explains to everybody why they should have a mask on when she's out and about and goes into the science about it all. And she's 7. But my daughter also had a couple of her friends over that in their neighborhood that they understand have been social distancing. And those kids were not going to have masks on. So I just can't see how teachers are going to be in any capacity be able to manage them. But it's just, I guess we'll just have to have good faith and hope it happens. But I can see a classroom management problem that would be pretty tough. That's all.
So,
Sorry,
please.
go ahead.
No, go ahead. Sorry, Dr.
I was going to
Bowen.
say that goes into my second question was about as part of these health and safety requirements, I know that it will take extra time to implement and do these things. And along with the masks, I know people had questions about hand washing and how much class time or instruction time is it going to be taken away because of these extra things that have to be done now?
Yep.
This is a consideration. And I was going to say that we are maybe 5 slides into this conversation. And you know that, so those who are familiar with how I facilitate some of our group work with our communities, I always say that we don't start with limiting ourselves. We always start big, and there's lots of opportunity to scale back. And so while I'm not disagreeing with the perspective or concerns, it's just we've got a long way to go before we start getting into what might not be possible or difficult.
That's
because mask wearing might be the easiest piece of what we need to conquer moving forward.
Thank you, Dr. Harmon, for bringing that up. Would you please continue?
So in addition to the general guidance of just personal protective equipment in terms of face coverings, there's also drop-off and pickup. So they talked about a system of drop-off and pickup where where school districts must enable that 6 feet of distancing. They give some suggestions for that, which are listed here, something like staggering drop-off and pickup times, one-way traffic flows, different ways to greet students, placing distance markers on walkways and pathways are all options for that. But that is also something that must be taken into consideration. So once we've gotten our students actually to the school, how they enter the school building and how they proceed when they're on campus, even before they get into our buildings. And that goes into health screening at entry. So one of those requirements is checking for signs of illness for all staff and students at entry each day. And then I just listed the symptoms as of today of COVID-19. And we know that over this process, those symptoms have changed slightly and adapted, and it's possible that they could change again. But right now, these are the current symptoms. And so a protocol for checking and health screening would include assessing for these symptoms, and then a notification process for if they develop over the course of the day. And then there's grouping students. So once they are at the school and in the building, how they proceed within groups. And so keeping consistent groups and keeping those groups together day to day without cross mingling those groups limits spread and makes it easy to track exposure if something happens or a student becomes ill or a staff member becomes ill. So that's a consideration of how students are grouped and keeping that consistency from day to day and that tracking system. Physical distancing, of course, we've talked about the 6 feet apart within each of those groups. So once the students are in their student groups, they still need to maintain their social distancing within that group. And then meals. Limiting gatherings and mixing of classes in the cafeteria or other communal spaces while eating. And that's a key one because that's one of the few times that even when you are a mask wearer, you're not wearing a mask. And all of those areas that a mask is designed to protect and prevent others from being exposed to are exposed. So limiting those gatherings and mixing of classes is an important consideration and a requirement as well. And then, as Director Bowen had questions about the hygiene practices. So creating space, and then OSPI was ever so kind to list all of the times that a child or an adult should wash their hands while on campus. So once they arrive at school, before meals or snacks, after outside time, after going to the restroom, after nose blowing or sneezing, and before they leave the building to go home. And then bus transportation. And so they didn't give general recommendations. They gave some general recommendations around transportation and bus transportation in general, about preventing COVID spread and maximizing the outside air. So keeping windows on the school bus open, encouraging students, actually it seems like, to not ride the school bus, to walk, bike, or be driven by a caregiver as much as possible. That also creates some social distancing space by having fewer students on the bus. Riders and staff members must wear a cloth face covering while on the bus. And cleaning and disinfecting frequently touched surfaces on that bus. And then that gets into the cleaning and disinfecting procedures and protocols. And so OSPI, and I know that initially during closing, there was some conversation about defining the differences between these terms and what that means. And they did a really nice job, I think, in just layman's terms of defining the difference between cleaning, sanitizing, and disinfecting, and the importance of all of that being a part of the kind of maintenance protocol for school districts once we open. And so just a reminder that sanitizing and disinfecting without cleaning reduces the efficacy of the sanitation and disinfection process. So all three of those are major components of that according to OSPI. So questions about health and safety requirements now that we've expanded it beyond just facial coverings?
Yes. So I'm a little concerned about bus transportation, and I'm trying to visualize this, how this is going to work. We have so many of our kids riding our buses. So are we going to abide by this cleaning, sanitizing, and disinfecting at every turn, or because kids come in and step out and kids move around? So how is that going to be handled? Has there been discussions on that?
So I apologize, Director Vangadaslam and other board members. I should have led with the spoiler alert that KSD does not have a full reopening plan as of date. So this is truly a conversation about how we proceed moving forward. We've had some conversations, so we'll get into a little bit of detail of the work we've done thus far about what are the considerations and concerns around transportation and some other areas, even before this guidance came out from OSPI. And we've not identified a hard and fast solution for moving forward, but it is a concern. And it depends a little bit on the model for opening that we choose, to the extent of the details of the cleaning and disinfecting as far as transportation goes.
Yeah, I'm also worried about the one-way traffic flow as well. Especially schools like Panther Lake. There's a lot of details there that I'm hoping we will involve the city, I would assume.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So, Dr. Harmon, my biggest question as we're going through these slides is, and thank you for letting us know we don't have a reopening plan. So, and this is just informational. So my biggest question is, are there going to be teams organized? When I look at all these things, it's such specialized. So bus drivers, people actually, driving children have a different, they have a different understanding of how that works versus someone who doesn't. So I'm wondering how the communities are going to be set up, or the different pieces of this seem like it's going to need different committees to really get in there. And is there a plan to involve the people that do the actual work in helping to create our full reopening plan?
Yes, and now we've skipped to the end of the presentation, so I'm going to forego all of the slides in the middle and just jump there. No, I'm kidding. We're not, but we will get to that. There's some slides as we get through. Once we've kind of hauled out what OSPI is asking us to do, and then we'll talk about how we, as a KSD team, kind of see moving forward and engaging our stakeholders, internal employee stakeholders and external community stakeholders in developing that plan.
Dr. Harmon, I'm curious, and perhaps this is going to come at the end too, but obviously taking cleaning to a whole different level, do we have somebody working on the budgeting for our custodial staff and what that could look like for our district?
So that is a component of this, and we started talking early on, even with our spring planning, about budgeting for cleaning and cleaning supplies and PPE, and we'll address. There's some information about that a little bit later on in this presentation as well.
Okay, thank you.
Because regardless of the plan that we choose, we're going to need to do some of those things. So we'll talk a little bit more about our steps moving forward. But this is just, like I said, we're walking through all of the pieces that OSPI is requiring us to consider as we think about whatever our opening plan is. So these things that we've discussed so far are kind of agnostic of the model we choose for opening in the fall. And so in addition to the just general health and safety requirements, there's labor and industry. There's a section on labor and industry and employee health and safety requirements as well. Excuse me, that provide an additional layer of requirement for school districts as an employer, not just as a service provider in terms of instruction and education and social emotional support for students. So again, they have classified the K-12 school environment as a medium risk transmission area. And so what that means is that the 6-foot distance has to be maintained for job tasks. They consider the risk of transmission because people are in closer contact with each other for more than just a few minutes on a regular basis. That additional controls may be needed depending on the type of work that's done, especially when that physical distance can't be maintained. OSPI has also recommended that each location have a site-specific COVID-19 supervisor that is responsible for monitoring the health of employees and enforcing the job safety plan. And then this gets into a little bit of the detail, that we were talking about earlier about the facial coverings. And so the specific rule is that anyone in the building for longer than 15 minutes has to wear a cloth face covering that fully covers their mouth and nose or a higher level of protection. And then for those students and employees who cannot or should not wear that mask, then the employer, so as we're talking about this from the perspective of employer, must provide additional safeguards to address those risks. And so that means that we can provide an alternative plan for instructional delivery. So possibly remote learning for those students if it's a health condition or something like that. We talked a little bit before about the use of face shields or other protective equipment combined with additional distance or space if they cannot wear a mask. And then other accommodations that might mitigate depending on the severity of the risk or other needs as they arise. So in addition to that, because we're talking about the employer perspective of the school district and the requirements as an employer, additionally, a worker could refuse to perform work that they consider hazardous or unsafe due to COVID-19. And it's unlawful for an employer to take an adverse action against that worker if they meet certain refusal requirements. There's lots of detail about that. And I believe a proclamation resolution that the governor signed as well about a month ago. But nevertheless, as an employer, we have to provide high-risk individuals with a choice of access to either leave or unemployment benefits if we cannot agree upon or provide an alternative work arrangement for their duties that is health safe. So before we go into the work group for OSPI and their recommendations for models. We have questions about health and safety. We're kind of closing out that health and safety piece right now.
Do every one of our sites have a full-time nurse on site? When you
No, they
talk
do.
about, each site needs a COVID monitor, would that be the person who would perform that function potentially?
So as a reminder, anything that changes job duties or responsibilities or working conditions is a mandatory subject of bargaining. And our school nurses are members of our KEA bargaining agreement or bargaining group. And so it's not quite as simple as just making that a task or a requirement of nurses, even if we had a nurse at every building, which we do not. So we do not have nurses at every building. But it does call out very clearly that this is someone's work or would be someone's work at every site where there are people in the building.
So Dr. Herman, that brings up a question about state funding. Has there been discussions about increasing? As everybody knows, we are paying, state is paying for what, 4 nurses out of what we have?
Yes, and we do supplement that in Kent School District and provide above and beyond what the state provides. But
Right.
it is not a nurse in every building.
But
I've not seen
yeah.
I've not seen anything that says that they are going to provide increased funding related to nursing or medical support or medical staff support in terms of symptom monitoring and those kinds of things related to COVID. No.
Been plenty of conversations about funding, but increased funding has not been one of them.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank
Other
you for that
questions?
question, though. Yes,
Well, I think that would be a great thing for us to work on with
absolutely.
WASDA as well.
Yes.
And if I may, I mean, to that point, Director Vengadasalam, the budget the document, if you all review, have reviewed it, does speak to the increased costs that are associated with a lot of these provisions, and it's certainly something that we're all considering. Specifically related to, imagine the costs associated with a full technology rollout. In Kent School District, we were ahead of the curve on that for a lot of our students. But for many districts, those cost barriers related to that are going to be even higher. So, I imagine there are a lot of other school districts who are also considering those additional costs.
And I might add that transportation is going to be a huge part of the cost because we're not going to be able to put a full bus load of these kids. And that's going to be a big hit. I have some grave concerns how we're going to make all this work.
Thank you. Those are all considerations and strong possibilities. We still don't know for sure, but you and I we've had conversations about that. We are asking for more guidance, specifically what those numbers look like for students, not just dollars. But when we find out more, we'll certainly be sharing that with you once we know.
Thank you, Dr. Watts.
Absolutely.
So in the OSPI document, they call out, as I think we would all agree and believe, that there's no substitute for face-to-face learning. It is the model that we are probably all most familiar with, and I would argue would probably be the model of choice for most parents, students, educators. And to that end, that is what OSPI is working toward for school districts. However, a work group was convened to consider what options might look like moving forward across the state. And so they encourage local school districts to work with their students, their families, and their staff and local health authorities to, under the flexibility of the OSPI guidance, to choose and adapt a concept or a model that works best for their school community. They also believe that that model that they have should offer some ability to pivot is the word that we've been calling it in executive cabinet, or shift on a continuum, if things are moving ahead and progressing at a rate better than we'd hoped, meaning moving back to what we all would believe is a more traditional school day experience. Or if for some reason things get worse, shifting to a more continuous remote learning model, if we need a shorter or longer term school facility closure. Hopefully not to the extent that we experienced this past spring. But that's the other recommendation of OSPI. So whatever model is chosen and planned for opening in the fall, it offers that flexibility to move along a continuum based on the health needs of the community.
And I'm being, you know, several emails that I've been receiving or conversations with individuals are really emphasizing, and I'm sure I'm not talking to you, that you're not very aware of this, or Dr. Watts is not all our board directors are probably aware of it, but the equity in the way we're going to choose to do a lot of these learning can present more barriers to a lot of our students that already have a lot of barriers. And we cannot lose sight of that. We cannot lose sight that we can't be inclusive as much as humanly possible to erase barriers for children to learn. And these new concepts might especially touch upon some of our kids that already have too many barriers.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Very true. And we'll talk about some of the models that the state has put forth and some of the recommendations or some of the considerations for equity in that. So to support the district plan, I talk about the state pulling together a cross-section across the state of Washington, 120 representatives to consider plans. They had several meetings, and then they had several smaller group meetings to focus on some of those technical and operational issues, like Dr. Bettinger alluded to with, so for example, transportation being a technical work group, and then focusing on that and people more locally and closer to that work than people who are just theorizing about the way that may work best. And so this is the list of the state's smaller work groups and their plan. And then they had three main assumptions based on their work. Is that we'd plan for a reopening based on recommendations from and safety guidance from the Department of Health, Office of the Governor, and L&I, which we've talked about. Excuse me. The districts will be allowed to build their plan to fit their local context and needs. So we talked about OSPI's intention that we engage our community and our staff in that work, and that we create a plan that would allow us to shift along that continuum of health and safety guidelines. So those are the three main assumptions that guided the recommendations from OSPI's work group. And then our requirements, obviously, is that we have to plan for that transition between face-to-face and continuous remote learning, which might be required if a health authority decides. We need to have a flexible school calendar with additional days included to address emergency or short-term school closures and the need to transition learning environments. Because remember, right now, we believe, according to OSPI, that there will not be a waiver of instructional days or hours for the 2021 school year, and build a more effective and sustainable remote learning model ready to be deployed if schools are required. And so that goes back to I think the number 4 commitment of OSPI at the beginning of this presentation. So, ta-da! What scheduling concepts did OSPI recommend? So keep in mind that these are 3 of those in the middle of that continuum. So understanding that, yes, traditional opening is on one end of that continuum and full remote learning is on the other end of that continuum. And then these 3 concepts are the concepts in the middle that would govern. So a split or rotating schedule with continuous remote learning. And so that continuous remote learning and how it's split could be lots of ways, by age, grade, classroom, content area, student need, all kinds of ways. One example that OSPI gave was elementary face-to-face. and secondary at a distance. So serving pre-K through, in our instance, elementary would be through 6th grade first, and then using all of the school buildings to serve those students, elementary, middle, and high. That would facilitate social distancing for all of our littles. And then we could phase in face-to-face learning for secondary students as health-wise the situation improved across our region or community. But until then, secondary students would learn remotely. That's a split kind of schedule option or example of a plan from OSPI. Then there's the phased-in opening with continuous remote learning. An example of that would be phasing it in by priority. So one option could be serving all elementary students first. Another could be serving students who are furthest from that educational justice first. So for example, I think President Hamada was talking about concern about students who don't have access, right, have those larger gaps and continuing to be disenfranchised. And so this would be an opportunity to prioritize those students for in-person learning, and then remote learning for other students would be the model. That's what a phased in scheduling concept could look like. That's an example. And then the final scheduling concept would be continuous learning 2.0. Believe it or not, that is what OSPI calls it. And that is just an improved version of the continuous learning model that most districts implemented this spring, meaning that as best interpreted, all students would experience remote learning, only with improvements to, as they suggested and alluded to, the learning platform with professional development for staff, students, and probably the adults in their homes would be what would live under that continuous learning 2.0 scheduling concept. So quite a bit of work for the work groups, quite a lot of length thus far in our conversation, but this is in a nutshell what those scheduling concepts are that are listed. And within these three, there's lots of variation of what that could look like. Like I said, the split and rotating schedule alone has several ways that that could happen. By the way, in the PowerPoint, I apologize, I didn't orient us to what was going on in the PowerPoint. In the title, I referenced the page numbers in the plan where you can refer to the information. So I should have called it out. Seems obvious, but I just want to make sure I said it there.
Yeah, it's very helpful.
So because it is, you try to fit a little bit of information on the slide, but if you want deeper detail, this is where you could find that.
Yeah, great.
So there's that piece. So in addition, so once those plans are laid out, OSPI says, great, you're ready to implement whichever one you choose based on your community and how you work that through. Here's some key themes that we want you to consider on top of health and safety. They're not surprises. I won't spend a lot of time because our time is short and I want us to process some other things, but we know professional development will be a theme with however we move forward. Conquering the ability to obtain feedback in a virtual setting. Safety and training and orientation. So when we open, how do we train, as Director Bowen said, not just our adults, our children, on what safety is. Supporting our transitions for our students. So what does a move up day look like for students if they're partially still distance learning or if social distancing is still in place? Diagnostics and screeners. So what does that look like when we're talking about identifying our inclusive ed students, our high cap students, and what those needs might be for the fall and as we set that up, our universal screeners, and how we identify what those are. How do we administer those moving forward? A focus on leading with social emotional needs and the importance of that as we transition back into a face-to-face setting, or if we have to continue remote learning. Leveraging our community partners and communication throughout our community. Making sure we have family and student voice. We've gotten better at our translations and languages. And then they mentioned the spoken languages, home languages, and then American Sign Language as well. A focus on classroom and school-wide behavior supports. So taking it back to the social emotional, and in this respect, not just discipline in that piece, but focusing on the social emotional impact of remote learning and that it had on students and how that may manifest itself when students return to school in a more traditional sense, or if they have to return back to remote learning. So those are all things on top of the health that we have to consider, key themes for implementation, and there's significant detail around those pieces and action steps, suggestions from OSPI regarding each of those themes. And the most important piece of this is that there's a timeline, because time is not infinite. Although this plan was first released on July 11th, we have until 2 weeks before the start of school for our board to adopt a plan. And we submit that plan to OSPI and the State Board of Education. It didn't necessarily say that they had to approve our plan, but we did have to have it on file with them. So that would mean for us, if our first day of school is August 27th, that we would need to have a plan to our board by the 12th of August of 2020, no later than. That is not the target date for this action to happen. That is the latest date that that could happen in order for us to start school on the 27th. I think it was Director Hamada who mentioned some things in what we were doing in terms of planning so far, in terms of getting protective equipment or cleaning supplies. And I put a little asterisk down here saying that certain aspects of the plan may require action prior to adoption. And I would say that purchasing cleaning supplies, purchasing masks are two examples of those actions that would start to take place prior to adoption of a plan, because regardless of the model that we choose as a district, we know we're going to need those supplies in an increased amount over what we would traditionally order. Although we know a date of when we have to submit a plan to OSPI, they have not given us all of the details of what that plan must include or the format that it must be in. Right now, the statement is that that will come in early summer. And from a science standpoint, technically the first day of the summer is still about 4 days away. So I guess they've got a little bit of time just to be within the early summer guidelines. Believe it or not, it is still spring. So maybe they're going by the scientific definition of summer and not our body's definition of summer. So I think you all have asked, what have we done thus far? So what have we been doing besides just waiting for OSPI to give us some guidance? So up until this point, we as an executive cabinet have been closely monitoring guidance from other states. So the beauty of being on the West Coast and kind of ending the school year later than some of those who start school in early August is that they end in May. And so they were in the place where their states were developing guidance and issuing guidance early on. So monitoring what other states guidance look like, reviewing guidance from health authorities. So monitoring the CDC guidance as well, I think how that was updated and changed. Investigating centralized purchasing and acquisition of protective equipment. So we've been having conversations about what does that budget line look like? How do we store that? How do we distribute it? So that we're monitoring when we need to reorder and that we constantly have enough supply and that we're not running out. We've engaged central office staff in a preliminary explanation of fall opening models that was more theoretical when kind of everything was on the table without OSPI's guidance of their 3 school opening concepts. And then we've engaged our community in a thought exchange around fall reopening. So that's as far as we've gone thus far. None of that has led to a plan that is fully baked, typed up, ready to present in any way. We are still in that engagement phase. And so that leads to the what's next. So what does our future work look like? And it's having targeted internal work groups with participation opportunities from all of our labor groups. So Director Bettinger, you called this out even before we got here. We've got to have some of those technical experts as part of this group, as part of this work. Because what sounds like a very easy thing to implement can be more complicated when you know the operations and what it takes to pull that off. And then providing input sessions with our external KSD community groups. We've outlined some of those already. And since we already have those stakeholder groups formed, it's not necessarily that we need to create new stakeholder groups. We just need to engage them around this work. But we know that we have about 6 weeks.
Have you already reached out to staff? Have you already reached out to all staff to give them an opportunity to participate in various groups?
No, we're just starting that now that we have the guidance from OSPI.
Okay.
So Dr. Oh, sorry, go ahead. Can we not have a thought exchange with staff as well? I see it's only community. Kind of reach the larger, our educators in the buildings?
There's nothing preventing us from engaging our staff in a thought exchange around those concepts. I know that the thought exchange that was open before was open to all. You didn't have to be a community member, or just a community member, or just a staff member. You could be either or. Sometimes we are both, a community member and a staff member. But if we wanted to do something that was staff specific, we could do that as well.
And I'd just like to add, Dr. Harmon, that I was spoke briefly and attended the Kent Area Roundtable PTSA meeting, and they asked me directly a couple of things to bring forward. And they asked, everybody in the room was asking that they have some input, and I see PTSA on there. Just want to bring that again forward. That was very important that they have some, say in what's going to go on, or at least be included in a lot of that. So I'm bringing that forward.
That's duly noted. And as you see, we do have quite a few community representatives, and we'd like to have as many as possible, but those are a few who have been identified. Some who may not typically be at the table. That's also a part of our equity work as well.
So when we say input sessions, does that mean thought exchange, or what does that mean? What does that look like in this COVID period?
So no matter the, I guess, name we give it, it's going to be some kind of remote or virtual opportunity. We're not going to be able to have a face-to-face conversation. Well, I suppose we could, it depends, because I think that starting next week, King County can apply for phase 2. So it's hard to say in an ever-changing environment whether that would be a remote experience or a face-to-face opportunity with these groups. But it would be an opportunity for them to hear and really understand some of the things that are required of us as a district, so that when they provide input or feedback on a initial foundation that we may give them, they'll understand where this is coming from. It's one of the reasons why this particular work session is happening this way, so that others can go back and watch and see for themselves through the links and read the report and see the details of what's required of a school district to move forward in the fall.
And I might add, Dr. Harmon, I was just on a meeting this weekend, all day Saturday, and there were 1,000 people on that site. And they had the ability through chatting that they'd set up, not everybody could be seen, but going through that, they had the ability to ask live questions as we went through it. And it ran extremely well. I know there was costs involved in that, so I can't imagine that. But personally speaking, with such an important issue, I'm not sure we can achieve what we want to feel all our stakeholders have a say in it by our setup of thought exchange. That's just my personal feeling.
I was going to bring up that same concern, because a lot of the families that have barriers around technology and being able to access this stuff are the families that we want to hear from. And how, if things are set up to be technology based, how can we engage the families that aren't secure with technology, or that may not understand it, or have English as a second language? How can we make sure that their voices are heard if it's just being technology only?
Right. And all our students with IEPs, is there a group for all, for parents and all our students with all our special ed students with IEPs and 504s?
Director Bettinger, you're asking, is there a specific
Well-
communication strategy or?
Well, with the
maybe
input
clear.
sessions, with input sessions, we're talking about PTSA, Equity Council, Education of Color Cohort. We have our Dyslexia Advisory Board. And, but I just didn't know if we have internally a group that is, like a committee, just like the Dyslexia Committee or the Fiscal Recovery Task Force or any of those, specifically, for parents and advocates for our students
Sure.
with IEPs and 504s.
And I'll let Dr. Herman maybe speak further to it. These are examples that just to give those who are viewing examples of the community groups that we may be tapping into for input. But I don't see any reason why there's still paper and pen, there's paper and pencil opportunities. I just think we need to think very carefully with safety in mind, obviously. But technology is one way, it's not the only way.
So if I can suggest, we have 6 weeks to go. If we can have some key folks, like say 6 people from the PTSA, but they would ask the relevant questions, and then they would come together with you to give some feedback, something to that degree where you are not having multiple meetings with every single group out there. So can this be done in a way where you have a concentrated group that's coming forward with what others are thinking? Think about a plan, something like that.
I think what we're hearing too, and I totally agree, and correct me if I'm wrong, is a representative sample, a group that represents, to the extent that we can, our broadest and broader communities. We're hearing that loudly, clearly, and we'll come up with, I think, the best plan that we can to make sure their voices are heard. I like the ideas you've mentioned. I think those are fairly simple, not always easy, but fairly simple to execute.
Yeah,
And I just want to bring up this too. I don't see any inclusion of our students.
Yes, students' voice is very important too.
Yes, we have discussed that as well. And again, not providing every option available. We want to let you know that we are hearing you. And as a matter of fact, had a conversation with a student today, and I don't see any reason why students would not be a part of this process. Student voice matters greatly.
Absolutely. And I had a very interesting conversation with an administrator in a different district about a whole different subject, but we were talking about people that really need to be at the table that never come to the table. And that was an interesting conversation. I want to go over that a lot more. She had some absolutely fantastic ideas about reaching people that never feel comfortable coming to the table. So I just wanted to put that out there.
It's important.
It's some ideas that I have never thought about. So.
And
Dr. Harmon, yes.
I appreciate the recommendations and the feedback on that. And I also will say that this is a sample, a representative example of groups that we intend to reach out to. And given the short timeline, one of our strategies will have to be leveraging some of those kind of stakeholder committees that already exist. And have them work with them to be information getters for us or providers for us in terms of that opening, getting some feedback on the opening.
When do you plan to open the floodgates to start this process of that?
That is an appropriate description of what this work will be over the next 6 weeks.
I use that for a reason.
So quite honestly, I would expect that within a week, we need to be having heavy clamoring conversations across our district, as will every district, I'm sure, be engaged in this work, because we can't just wait until we filed a plan with OSPI and the State Board of Education to start the implementation process. That gives us 14 days to get everything done that needs to take place. So it is an immediate call to action that's one of the reasons too why this work session couldn't wait.
And I just want to add, Dr. Harmon, if there's any way that I can help further, I'm at your mercy.
So there is work. So, you know, I always have an activity, which we won't have time to do, but I would greatly appreciate, maybe you can email it to Karen independently, and we can figure out a way to put all of the information back out to you all, so that it's not a violation. It's just a kind of a sharing out and not a conversation. Because what I intended to do was have us go through and, based on kind of what you've heard, what you've had time to process in the limited time that we had this evening, identify a point of view that you would use to identify yourself. You don't have to do that now, but think about what that is. And then based on that point of view, identify one component that you heard this evening that was the best piece of this. And then based on that same identified point of view, identify one thorn, so a rose and a thorn, the most difficult component of what you heard this evening. But it has to be based on the point of view that you identified. And so it's okay, it's however you would identify yourself. And so it would be helpful, even if you didn't want to go down the point of view pathway, having better information from you all about what you feel is the most difficult or problematic component that we have to conquer moving forward, and then what is the best or most hopeful component. So if not a rose, then a rosebud.
Excellent, Dr. Harmon. I love that.
And then, of course, there's resources. So again, this will live, because it'll live on BoardDocs and for you all as well. These are links that are live to the full OSPI plan, to the CDC's decision tool for school districts, and then Washington State Department of Health guidance. And then the governor's office had some sporting guidance in general about sporting. And then I think the last page or so talks about school district and kind of youth sports. And because we are right at time, as much as I want to spend more time talking about things, I think there's formal actions that have to be taken if we continue. So I will defer to someone else for what's next.
All right. As far as what's next, are you talking about a resolution or something that we want to?
No. I'm not sure if we have to say something to extend the meeting, or do we just say we're done, or are we allowed to keep talking, or that's what I mean. Because I think we're at our hour's time, even if you count the few late minutes that I stole back.
Well, I understand that we have to respect one of our directors has to be off at 7:30. So I'm thinking perhaps we have to conclude this meeting. So
this will not be our last opportunity that we'll talk about this, I'm sure. I'm sure that you'll have additional conversations with Dr. Watts as well. And we look forward to you hearing more about our engagement with our stakeholders and our progress toward developing a plan.
Well, I'd just like to thank you, Dr. Harmon, for all your excellent work, your presentation, and all that you've had to deal with in the last few months. It's been extraordinary, not just for you, but for all our staff. And we all appreciate that very much. And we're going to need buy-in from all our community to make this work. And it's not going to be easy even going forward. So I want to thank you very much for your presentation. And I'd like to thank all of the community for tuning in out there, and all the staff that's on virtual here live. And at that, it is 7:37, and I'm adjourning this meeting.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Have a good
Dr.
night.
Harmon.
Night.
Night.